All right. So okay. I think the beginnings of this I guess invitation to present to you guys about Mark Catesby kind of came on the coattails of a promotional video that I was doing in conjunction with the Mark Catesby Center, which is run out of the Thomas Cooper Library and closely associated with their rare books collection there. The Mark Catesby Center was originally called the Catesby Commemorative Trust, but some creative finagling and whatnot, it is now physically housed at USC. And the promotional sort of video that they were doing, I'm a faculty affiliate for them, and I was talking about the plants that Mark Catesby depicted in his Natural History of the Carolinas. In conjunction with working with the Catesby Center, though, I'm also helping draft a chapter for a book that was intended to be published coincident with his first centennial arrival in the Carolinas, which is 1722. So that year's coming up. And the focus of this chapter is on the plants that he didn't depict. And so that's kind of the background on the title here. Some background on Mark Catesby. Of course, he published this monumental work, which has been likened to something like a pre-Audubon kind of treatment of birds of North America. He was an English fellow. He was born in 1683 on March 24th, so he's got a birthday coming up. I think he'll be 338 years old this year. His first arrival in North America was in 1712. He landed in Virginia, where he had his sister had married a well-to-do colonist. 1714, he sailed to the West Indies, and then this interim period of time, he secured benefactors in England, and with funds to take on this travel through the New World, he returned to his base in Charleston in 1722 and took notes, traveled around, experienced things, illustrated things, and returned to England, where he commenced producing this 2-volume coffee table sized book. And that took him from 1729 to 1747. And then 1749, 2 years after he had completed it, he died. And that's it. So not really. This is the page that I tore out of the title page that I tore out of one of the volumes at Thomas Cooper. It shows you this very long, the very lengthy title that he has. And the entire thing is the natural history of, hold on, I gotta admit somebody. Wanda Pettis. All right. Natural history of the Carolina, Florida, and Bahama Islands, containing figures. And I'm highlighting this because he's kind of trying to promote himself. In order to get this kind of a book created, they had to get a list of subscribers, and it was issued in sets of 5 sets per volume. So volume 1 took from 1729 to 1732 to publish, and then sets 6 through 10 comprised volume 2, and that took him a bit longer to complete. And then for whatever reason, he had 20 more plates that he had created, so he issued an appendix in 1747. But in order to get those subscribers, let's look at this. He says this work contains figures of the birds, beasts, insects, fish, and all this sort of stuff, plants, forest trees, shrubs, and other things not hitherto described or very incorrectly figured by authors. And he's also including a new and correct map of the countries. And with his perfect English, of course, he ends the entire thing with a preposition. So anyway, you can kind of get the sense that he's really trying to drum up support for this work, because it's going to be, groundbreaking work. It's one of the first works of its kind for North America, where the plates were issued in color, and and he includes some accompanying text to go with it. So the other important part about this title is that it's kind of overlooked, but it's in the red text towards the bottom. He talks about the observations on the air, soil, waters, and some remarks upon the agriculture. And that's basically what he's talking about. All of that is included in his account, which is a 44-page account of what he saw and what he experienced there. And it's sort of the text associated with it, the background. It's actually like the journey, the beginning of his journey. And it's just kind of ironic that his observations are quite often the least observed part of the work. They tend to be overlooked by most people because the plates themselves are so attractive. They get most of the attention. But it should not be overlooked. And so the question is, why is it so important? It's because in some cases, it's the only record that we have that Catesby actually saw these things. So he does have some specimens, herbarium specimens that are deposited in the Sloane Herbarium at Oxford. There are occasionally some things that he illustrated with watercolors that are held at the Royal Library, which did not get translated into a plate that made it to the book. So the account includes a lot of stuff that otherwise is not illustrated. And it's the only sort of proof that we have that he actually saw these things. Okay, so we're going to try to focus on the botanical observations, of course, because this is, Native Plant Society. And basically, I'm going to talk about some of the plants that he mentions in the account, but aren't necessarily depicted or illustrated outside of the natural history. And then any of the plants that he actually did depict, but we're not quite sure what the heck they are. So, all right, as I mentioned earlier, the account is 44 pages altogether. It's broken up into several subsections. He talks about the air, and when he says air, he means climate. The soil, it's kind of a combination of the geology and soils that make up the area of Carolina where he explored. Water is basically the hydrology. He gives a broad brush, real quick summary of the Aborigines of America, and that he tries to cover from Canada to the northern parts of Mexico. So a lot of this is really just kind of his hearsay and research, and not necessarily stuff that he actually encountered himself. But he does spend a lengthy amount of time on the Indians of Carolina and Florida, talks about their habitations, arts and manufacturers, how they hunted, that sort of thing. And then he gives a really good breakdown of the agriculture of Carolina, including how to make tar and pitch from pine trees. And in that section, sometimes there are some plants that the origin isn't quite clear. They probably were already brought to North America from the colonists and already in cultivation. So they're sort of things that were more familiar to Catesby anyway. And then he goes through a whole section of all kinds of critters. So some of the plants that are described in the account that aren't otherwise depicted include this thing that I haven't quite been able to nail down called Elaternus. And the closest thing that I can get to trying to make a connection with is something like Italian buckthorn. And I'll talk about that one in a little bit as well. He mentions blueberries, cane, which would be like our arundinaria, chestnut, Indian corn, Carolina gold, rice, kidney bean, American potato, yam, crab apples, strawberries, blackberries, red mulberry, muscadine, pines, babies, so firs, tilia or the lime tree, he calls it pavia or the buckeye, siliquastrum, redbud. Fagus would be beeches, ulmus, elm, salix, willows, sambucus would be elderberry, and hazelnuts and musclewood or hornbeam. All right. So the interesting part of the air of Carolina section is that he talks about the latitude and being that it lies in the northern temperate zone. So he's kind of telling us where we are on the map. And he gives us very precise coordinates for the latitude, but then there's no longitude. And what we have to remember is that at that point in time, calculating latitude was very easy pretty much, but longitude was much harder to kind of figure out where you were. You're trying to think of what a linear distance on the ground equates to in degrees. It's not very easy to figure that out. That's why sometimes folks prefer to use UTMs, because it's a meter, which is a standard unit of measurement that we all use pretty frequently. So instead, he basically reverts to a meets and bounds kind of system, saying that it's bounded by the east on the Atlantic, and then the Pacific is on the other side. And this, in that section too, and he talks about some of the kind of reasons why we have diverse habitats in that area. He talks about the seasons being mild and that sort of thing. And it reminded me of this passage in Porcher and Rayner's Wildflower book, where they explain that one of the reasons South Carolina has so many plant species compared, if you consider its size compared to North Carolina and Georgia, is because we have this perfect little slice of a wide range of physiographic provinces. And then we tend to be at the northern limit for a lot of more southerly distributed species. And then we're also at the southern limit for species that have a more northern distribution. And then Porcher and Rayner also mentioned that, you know, we're under the influence of a semi-tropical climate if you go further south in South Carolina, like Beaufort or Jasper County. And then to the northern counties, we end up being influenced by sort of a mid-Atlantic climate. Catesby kind of got all this, which is really cool. But throughout the rest of the section where he's talking about the climate, he doesn't really give any detail on what kind of plants he's seeing. He just mentions trees and smaller plants. He goes through the seasons and when things would bloom and fruit and die down during the winter. He talks about summer thunderstorms, lightning splitting trees. He does give accounts of ships that were pushed upwards of 3 miles inland over the marshes. So he's talking about a few of the habitats that he's seen there. And again, I'm kind of focusing on this sort of broader picture because most of the plates in Catesby's work are a branch of some tree species with a bird perched on it. There's not much background detail. You know, a lot of if you compare them to Audubon kind of got into putting a lot of other little details into the background. But Catesby's work tends to be sort of dry in that sense. And sometimes it's actually more useful because instead of trying to be very romantic, it's a little more scientific. So you can kind of tease out the details on some of Catesby's illustrations. He mentions glades and pine woods. He says that the climate is not conducive to the cultivation of wine, oil, which I presume would be like olives, dates, oranges, fig trees, and other sorts of things, because of the frosts that we get here are just too cold and would kill those things. And then he also mentions that many of the trees and shrubs retain their green throughout the year. They tend to be evergreen, which kind of gives us a clue that he might have been closer to the coastal plain, where we do have a lot more evergreen types of plants growing. But I'll talk about some of the little areas where you'll see this kind of phenomenon as well in a minute. The next section that he treats is the soil of Carolina. And he starts out at the coast and he describes basically the dune line. And then he's sort of moving inland from this point on. And that kind of makes sense to me because if you think about his arrival in Carolina, he arose from the east, landed in Charleston, and from that point he launched his exploration into the inland boundaries. And part of this section, he mentions various geologic and hydrologic features. So he's talking about sister sciences that would relate to plants, which is kind of interesting. And he includes some of the habitats that are encountered, like bays, marshes, and meadows. And then he focuses on the land as in terms of a more sort of economic, botanical sort of perspective. And he describes these I might have to let a dog out in a second, sorry. Describes these lands as rice land, which tends to be sort of swampy land, and it's not very good for much else because it's frequent inundation. And give me just a minute, I got to release a canine. All right. Okay. So yeah, rice land, and that it's limited to applications of cultivating rice, basically. Not good for much else because of the prolonged periods of inundation. He spells hickory with 2 C's and talks about oak hickory land, saying that it's a pretty good land because you can grow various types of grains, pulse, which would be legumes, roots, so potatoes and carrots, that sort of thing, herbage, which would be leafy greens. Then he also remarks that oak is good for timber and hickory is good for burning. And then he talks about the pine barren land, which he says is sterile, it's sandy, it's good for nothing, basically. And then he says, but the pine trees are really good for making masts and timber and pitch and tar and rosin and turpentine, and remarks that this kind of land covers about 1/3 of the country. So we're kind of getting it. I mean, a lot of this sounds sort of familiar if we've traveled through South Carolina and you see a lot of this stuff, and it's very relatable. So, and then he gives a little more detail. He talks about how these habitats tend to be interspersed with different types of habitats as well. And then he does this perfect description of a Carolina Bay, and I just love this. Talks about bay swamps. He describes their gradual sinking, which seems a little bit lower than the pine land that surrounds them. Water standing about 2 to 3 feet deep. The breadth is unequal, so that's a characteristic elliptical shape of Carolina bays. And then he lists a variety of evergreen trees and shrubs that are associated with these things. And here's where that elaternus reappears. And it makes me think that given the leaf morphology and stature of something like an Italian buckthorn, it makes me think that he might be talking about ilex, probably something like yaupon or something like that as well. He later gives a depiction of he calls it the field fare, which is basically an American robin. And literally he's referring to this bird as good eats when you're in the field. And it's depicted on its back with its legs up in the air and associated with something like a yaupon holly. And he goes into some description of it, and he uses this term again, elaternus. So I think that's probably a good indication that that's what he means by this thing. And it would make sense that ilex, the female trees, would produce a lot of juicy little fruits for the field fare to eat. So I think that's what that is, but not entirely sure. Worts, which are probably just some sort of generic term for smaller plants. Smilax, he calls something Cistus virginiana, which here I've said it's nomenclaturally that tends to equate to rhododendron canescens, but it's probably something in the Carolina Bays, something more akin to like viscosum. But all the other trees that I see here just, scream wetlands, Carolina Bay type evergreen foliage. And I love that he kind of nails that habitat. Here I'm just the aerial shot of some of the bays at Lewis Ocean Bay to give you that sense of the elliptical shape that they have. And this is kind of a depiction of what I think Catesby was trying to illustrate in his words. Now, he illustrated all of those plants that are in that list. There's loblolly bay, red bay, water tupelo, the rhododendron, smilax, and the sweet bay magnolia. But he sort of painted this picture without ever having the entire suite of the habitat, on a canvas or on a piece of paper. And this also gives you kind of a sense of like what his plates look like. Again, they're really sort of dry. It's a bird on a stick. But to his credit now, you got to consider that he was not a professional artist, that he took this on himself. He taught himself the art of engraving. He did all of his own illustrations. An interesting thing is that if you can browse some of these watercolors online through the Royal Library's website. And the cool thing is that the plates are always the mirror image of the actual watercolor illustration. And not all of the material that's on the watercolor gets translated to the print. So it's because it's such a labor-intensive process to do this sort of engraving. Some of the details that he had in the watercolors are not otherwise included in the prints. This might be another way he looked at it. I'm not sure if he would have liked the decapitated bunting there at the top, but you get the sense of, you know, all these things kind of juxtaposed in one place. He moves further inland and he describes a real scrubby oakland, which screams, in the nearest habitat I can think about is either in the Northeast Columbia or Peachtree Rock here, where there's white sugary sand and maybe a mix of some blackjack, but mostly turkey oak interspersed with some longleaf pine. And he says it's the worst kind of land. You know, it's just rejected because, I mean, what could you grow there other than curious botanists? And again, he's moving from the sea to the mountains. So it's the reverse of what we would typically say, South Carolina from the mountains to the sea. You know, that sort of line of thinking only happens after the colony has been established for quite a while, because the inland, the mountains and that sort of thing was just a completely uncharted territory. There weren't any landmarks that the colonists at least were familiar with. So he's going from the familiar to the less familiar as he progresses through this section. Some cool things that he mentions are spacious tracts of meadows confined by the hills. Somewhere in here he talks about grass that was 6 feet high, and it screams Piedmont prairie to me. And one of the reasons I think that is that he talks about canes in this area being very good for browse because they retain their leaves the year round. So that would eliminate, in my mind, the hill cane, which is Arundinaria appalachiana, and limit us to Gigantea or Tecta. And thinking along those lines in terms of where hill cane is typically distributed, as far as we know, would keep it kind of out of the foothills region and confine it to the lower parts of the Piedmont. So, you know, Rock Hill Blackjacks Heritage Preserve would be something that might have fit this kind of habitat that Catesby experienced. And also mentioned that he also mentions that there were numerous herds of buffaloes. There's some contention as to whether or not he actually saw these things. Some folks have said that there's absolutely no fossil evidence of buffalo or bison in eastern North America, citing that the bones that they find are of a more ancient relative. However, I find it kind of curious that Catesby also mentions later in some of his passages that he came across a place where the buffalo herds had been, and there were dung piles all around, and the trees had been the branches had been kind of pulled down as a result of their browsing on them and such. So it seems pretty clear to me that he must have seen something of a large bovine during his travels. He talks about floodplains and cane breaks, and again he mentions canes here, but he's talking about the soil being very rich because this is lower down, probably like Congaree National Park, where all the nutrients wash out of the hills and accumulate in these lowlands, and that the soil is so rich there, it's burdened by these huge trees, and the canes reach these unbelievable heights of 20 to 30 feet. I had gone through Catesby's mentioning of canes at some point in this research and compared it to what I could find in Bartram's travels. Bartram on a couple of occasions mentions canes that are as big around as a man's arm. I have never seen anything like that. So it makes me wonder if we're just seeing baby canes everywhere we go nowadays. And he finally makes it up into the Appalachians. But the trick here is that he's actually talking about what he experienced in Virginia. And if you think about Virginia, the Appalachians are actually a little bit closer to the coastline when you make it that far north. So it's a little bit easier to get to a higher elevation pretty quickly when you're moving inland. But there he does make a distinction between American chestnuts and chinkapin. In this one line, he talks about chestnuts and small oaks are the trees that grow in these mountains with some chinkapin. So he's clearly saying that there are two different things he's talking about here. He later depicts a chinkapin, but there is no evidence that he collected nor depicted American chestnut. The water section doesn't have much botanical content. He talks about how the rivers typically flow out of the mountains, that it's good for travel by boat. Fort Moore was an early name for the fort that was established around North Augusta on the Savannah River. And he talks about freshets, which are these seasonal floods that occur. And the fall line, he describes that in pretty good detail. And then he mentions some fossils that you find in the rivers are washed out by the banks, calls something glossa petrae, which are affectionately known as dragon's teeth, but they're probably just giant shark's teeth, vertebrae of some sea creatures. And also, I can't remember now, I think this may be the first mention, maybe it's the second mention of grinders of an elephant. This was the case where some African slaves had unearthed these stones near Stono, and being from Africa, they knew what elephants were, and they said those are the grinders of an elephant. Basically, is how it translated. So the first evidence that we had, like a Columbian mammoth or something roaming around parts of South Carolina many thousands of years ago. Okay, so skipping over the Aboriginal part because it's a real broad brush. He focuses on the Indians of Carolina and Florida, and a lot of folks at this point say that he's almost plagiarized Lawson, but the first line here says that he's citing Lawson, that he's borrowing from his work. So I think he's covered, and this is pre-copyright law and that sort of thing. So I don't think you can really hold him accountable for any sort of infringement on that. And it's just sort of a funny little line to read of how he sympathizes with Lawson, having died at their bloody hands and was roasted alive, because they perceive to have had injuries from him. And I included this. This is the fold-out map that's included in the natural history. Obviously, a lot of information is borrowed here because he did not travel as extensively as this map, the extent this map covers. But I'll focus in on some of this to kind of give you an idea of what he perceived Carolina to look like. You can see Port Royal there. He mentioned some places where there would be a good place to put a factory, and I think that's like right about the fall line, maybe, in the central part of South Carolina. He spells Cherokees interestingly. We've got these little Appalachian mountains and that sort of thing. So we know that he avoided some Cherokees. He mentions Totero in Virginia, and there's not much other mention about that anywhere else. Choctaws we would spell that Choctaw, and Chickasaws, which would be Chickasaws. So we know that he met Chickasaws and actually traveled with them a little bit, and this was around Fort Moore in that North Augusta area. And I'll include some more detail on that in a little while. And as part of that traveling, he avoided the Cherokees because they were not friendly together, and that he possibly met some of the Catawbas. And this map is borrowed from a different source to kind of give you an idea of where the different tribes or native nations were distributed. The Chickasaws actually were north of the Choctaws in northern Mississippi, just below the Tennessee line. And they had a dispute with the French. And so they sent an enclave to enjoy protection from from the French by the British to Fort Moore along the Savannah River. And they also served as kind of like they were just sort of a buffer zone for the British. And that was kind of a no-no because the Chickasaws were supposed to stay to the west of the Cherokee territory. So whenever the Cherokees found them, they would track them down and try to do bad things to them. And then, of course, the Catawbas would have been right around the North Carolina, South Carolina line. So he mentions some of the plants that the Native Americans used. Some cool things that I got out of this part were that Native Americans would mix bear oil and sanguinaria and apply that as a salve to their skin all over. And so Catesby describes their complexion as being sort of tawny, and that it wouldn't be like that if they didn't continuously apply sanguinaria, which stains their skin sort of a reddish brown color. It's kind of interesting. He talks about how they would make bows out of something called pseudoacacia, and there's a lot of controversy about the plate on the left there with the buffalo scratching up against it. James Reveal called this gliricidium, which is a more of a more southerly species. It might get into Florida, but Patrick McMillan and I think Richard Porcher looked at this in some detail and determined that it's probably more likely Robinia hispida that's being depicted here with the buffalo. And if you look at the stem, it is very, very hispid on as far as how Catesby depicted it. And then Catesby at some point goes through this lengthy description that he deposited specimens in the Sloan Herbarium. And in fact, when McMillan and Porcher looked at those things, they determined, oh, wow, this is actually hispida. And we know that Catesby was around the area of Fort Moore when he encountered this thing. So it's probably in that area. And I think they actually found it, and then it turned into an industrial park or something. So sad story. Anyway, it was either Robinia or Gladitia that they were using to make these bows, a strong pliant wood. And this is a really cool thing where he talks about their manner of hunting, where they would use a skin from a buck retaining its antlers and some of the leg bones, which they would then move and try to mimic a deer so that they could get very close before they launched a bow at the deer they were hunting. And he also mentioned, and this is where it's clear that he's not plagiarizing Lawson, because Lawson doesn't make any mention of using the seeds of Aesculus pavia to do this. But Catesby goes through this detail of taking buckeye seeds and sticking them in the eye sockets of the bucks. So that's where we get the name Buckeye. And so it would have looked sort of something like this if they, actually put the buckeyes in there. But the crazy thing is he goes through all this detail on this plant and there's not a specimen or an illustration anywhere. And then later he talks about having traveled with some Chickasaws and they were returning from this hunt and they had, lots of skins and some barbecued buffalo. And at this point they encountered some Cherokees, and that's why we know that he was traveling with the Chickasaws. The Chickasaws saw the Cherokees and they freaked out and they had to run and hide, and leaving the English to approach the Cherokees, who didn't want to have anything to do with them because they had word that there were Chickasaws in the neighborhood. And so Catesby and his traveling partners had to go back to Fort Moore and wonder what had happened of their Chickasaw friends. And they had to wait out the night. And the next day, the Chickasaws returned, whooping and hollering because they had made it back and they had evaded their enemies. And there was great celebration and all this great stuff was happening. And then when the daylight finally broke, and they could actually see what was going on, they kind of wandered about a little bit the area of Fort Moore and found a giant Cherokee war canoe. So at that point, they were really freaked out because they realized there were way more Cherokee than they had thought initially. Here's some room for speculation as to whether or not he met the Catawba. And the reason is because he does depict a Catawba tree. And this passage here where he's talking about it, he says that it was unbeknownst to the inhabitants of the land, meaning the British colonials that were there, that he brought it back from travels further inland, and the name of that's applied to the tree is a sort of source of speculation for a lot of people. It's almost sounds exactly like Catawba. So that's kind of why we think he may have at least made it in the Catawba territory. And he talks about all the sort of crops that the Native Americans had. Maize was being a big one, pumpkins and gourds and squash, strawberries, raspberries, black walnuts, and chinkapins, and various kinds of acorns and hickory nuts. And then he also focuses on live oak acorns being one that they used in particular. My understanding of that is that the live oak acorns tend to be contains some of the least amount of tannic acid compared to other species of oak. And this they would sort of mash into a meal, and they had some way of sort of storing it for a while once they had cooked it and prepared it. Then he's got a lengthy section on the agriculture of Carolina, and this includes a lot of plants that we'd be familiar with. He talks about in that passage that you just saw how they, well, I can go back to this, where they would essentially plant an area of land, and once it had been deprived of all its nutrients, they would just move on to the next one, cut a huge burden of trees and just leave them piled and then burn them. And so it's basically the same thing as like slash and burn that you see in a lot of other parts of the world now. And it makes you wonder, like, what we see in terms of South Carolina habitats today, how much of this kind of agricultural practice or land use practice was in place that would have changed, the face of the earth as we see it at this point. So these weird pictures that he's painting for us here in words that aren't depicted in his work they have this. There's a temporal aspect to them too that translates into other images that we would see now. Talks a good bit about rice. Cool thing about this one is that he mentions the grain from Madagascar, which is considered to be the origin of Carolina gold, which is potentially it's like a different species of rice that would have been in cultivation in Africa, not Asiatic in origin. So it's probably more likely that the Carolina gold rice that came from Madagascar is Oryza glaberrima. He says it's a more robust grain, and it can be grown in wet or dry soil. And so I think it's really cool that we have sort of the origins of an heirloom crop right there. Again, this one isn't necessarily illustrated. He gives us what he calls the rice bird, or a bobolink, perched on a branch of Oryza sativa. The image on the left-hand side of the screen is the watercolor that's at the Royal Library, and the image on the right is, of course, the plate that appears in the natural history, and that kind of gives you a good idea of how he had to sort of trace over the watercolor and then transfer that to the engraved plate, and that's why it ends up being reversed. And again, in this section, he continues to describe a lot of the same things that I showed on an earlier slide. Talks about kidney beans, potatoes, yams, crab apples, those sorts of things. Then he has a short section where he focuses on pine trees. He talks about the pitch pine, a richland pine, and a shortleaf pine, and a swamp pine. And we think these are basically longleaf pine, loblolly pine, shortleaf pine, basically, and possibly pond pine for the swamp pine. It's not very clear on some of these because the habitats that he describes are very vague, and it could be that he's referring to loblolly pine in the case of richland and swamp pine. So, and then he's got this other list of woody trees that are included in the landscape, but he doesn't have a specimen or a depiction of them anywhere else. So these are kind of, this is the only record that we have that he actually saw these things. And so I've got just two little botanical enigmas that he included for us to ponder. This Frutex aquaticus floribus luteus fructo rotundo quinque capsularis, and a dead gar. And he describes this thing in some really good detail and says it, occurs over a pretty broad area, and adorns the woods in February. And the thing is that it doesn't match anything anyone knows. Nobody's been able to identify this thing, with 6 petals. And then the description would imply that it has a 5-parted capsule for a fruit. Anyway, it's just this bizarre thing. So if anybody has any idea, some folks have suggested that it might be some sort of hypericum. It looks to me like it wants to be, at least fruit wise, some kind of ericaceous type thing, but I'm not entirely sure, especially with the description that it grows around shallow freshwater pond margins and that kind of thing. I was thinking something like Leucothoe, or I don't know, but it's definitely still a mystery. And then the last one is this little tiny bryophyte thing here, just listed as an unknown bryophyte. He doesn't even mention it. It's just added as a little adornment to this plate. And so I think that's all I've got. I do have a list of references that I use to put some of this together if y'all are interested in checking out any of those. Some of these phytoneuron publications are really cool and informative, and they're free to access online if you're interested. And I will stop sharing.
Okay, I'm going to reclaim the host status.
All right.
And invite our guest this evening to ask any questions that you might have about this wonderful presentation we just heard.
Yes,
John.
Can you hear me?
We can.
Early in the presentation, you indicated Catesby's concept of Carolina, and I remember seeing old maps showing our Virginia and Carolina as Catesby said, stretching all the way to the Pacific Ocean. Did he really think that it's stretched all the way to the Pacific Ocean? Because in his otherwise he was sort of describing South Carolina mostly.
I think in the imperial mindset of the time, that was how they viewed the world. I don't think that essentially they didn't consider the Appalachians or the Blue Ridge or the Mississippi to be a boundary in terms of what they were claiming as a colony. I think that's what's going on there. Not entirely sure. And maybe, and quite, it seems reasonable at that point in time that they were aware the Pacific was on the western shore, but they may not have had a very good understanding of how great that distance was. And again, if you remember that calculating latitude at that point in time was pretty easy, but longitude was a much more nebulous concept. So that might have been another reason why they felt like they weren't claiming the entire world when they did that. That's my take on it. I don't.
Okay. Any other questions?
Yes.
John again.
Well, what about that weird plant that with the garfish? A wild idea could be something like Symplochus, with blooming in February.
Okay. That's a good one. Yeah, I have to look at it. Does it have 6 petals?
I have to go back and
But it doesn't make a capsule though. It makes like a little banana-shaped fruit, doesn't it?
make sort of a droop-like thing.
Yeah. Yeah. So I mean, that's the thing, and I don't know. I think Jim Reveal. I think he tried to take a stab at one of those things and describe the fruiting part as one species and the flowering part as something else, which is okay, something that Catesby would do occasionally, taking artistic license. And some of his illustrations, he kind of blended 2 different plants, and one branch will have characters of something, and then it just sort of melds into this other species entirely. There is an interesting passage at the end of the appendix, after his treatment of the buffalo rubbing against the Robinia hispida, where he says something to the effect of, these illustrations might not be that great. They're the plants in particular, where they're drawn from dried specimens, probably don't capture everything that you would see from a real plant. And I think it makes me wonder, so he definitely was using his specimens to do some of these illustrations, which is really interesting to me. And that in some cases he was definitely revisiting some locations, or had at least the chance to encounter some of those species at different times of the year. Because, for instance, the plate with Loblolly Bay and Sweet Bay Magnolia, he shows the plant both in full flower and with fruit. And in neither case on those species would you ever encounter that on the same branch, because you have flowers that senesce and give way to fruits at a very protracted time frame. So it could be that that's the problem, that he got his notes confused and is describing 2 different plants in this one picture. If you think of the time that he spent, he started in 1722. He had 7 years before he was beginning this work, where he had amassed all these specimens and sent them back to England. His notes might have gotten wet while he was at sea or something, and the lead or whatever might have rubbed off on some of the pages. I don't know, but a lot of variables there to sort of give him a little wiggle room and let him out of a corner for being inaccurate.
Herrick, we have a question from Greg. He started out saying he enjoyed the presentation, but wanted to know, he said, did Catesby's work make references to changes in vegetation due to the impact of Native Americans in South Carolina, such as clearing, use of fire, etc.?
Yes. So I'm trying to think if it was the Robinia hispida, in fact. So there's plenty of times where Lawson, Bartram, Catesby all have mentioned vast areas being burned by Native Americans to kind of clear the underbrush and also make it easier for them to hunt game. We know now that the added benefit of that is that all the nutrients that are otherwise stored in the living material end up being dumped back into the ground, so it essentially acts as like a fertilizer. But he does make mention of revisiting, I think it was the site where the Robinia was, and that he could not find it because it had been recently burned extensively. So I think that might answer the question there.
Yeah. And Len wanted to know if we can see the natural history online.
Yeah, so the easiest place to see it right now is Biodiversity Heritage Library. I forget, I don't know, I think it might be heritagelibrary.org or something like that. But if you use a search engine for Biodiversity Heritage Library, that'll take you to their search engine, and then you can type in Catesby's Natural History or Catesby Natural History to find the works. There are 3 copies that are available in that that portal, and there may be others that are digitized elsewhere. But I feel like the navigation, page navigation in that environment is the easiest one to get through. And if you're gonna look that up, I would highly recommend looking at Jim Reveal's papers, those phytoneuron links, because he includes the actual modern scientific name as best as he could identify, and the page and plate number associated with them.
All right. Thanks for that. Any other questions? Oh, we had a follow-up to that one, I think. Are there plants in the natural history that are now extinct?
Man, I don't think so. That's a good question. I'll have to look at that. There definitely are some birds, like Carolina parakeet is definitely extinct. They may have the pigeon of passage included in that as well.
Mm.
I think all the plants are, unless that Enigma is an extinct plant, maybe that's the case.
All right. Other questions? This has been fascinating to me. I really have in recent years enjoyed reading the accounts of the early naturalists and in the Carolinas in particular. But while we've got our expert here, anybody else have questions for us, or for him, excuse me?
Well, if
I heard you guys talking
well,
before the presentation.
Here we go. Hollis.
I just, from before the presentation, I heard you talking about Chickasaw plum. It's not related to Catesby, but I was wondering if that is in fact native to the Midlands.
Yeah, so that's a question I grapple with too, and I think that Bartram makes some mention of it potentially being transported here by the Chickasaw enclave that was stationed around Fort Moore. So that's kind of the only historical kind of, or I guess the earliest historical idea that it was brought here from points further west.
Thanks.
Yep. And I'll just add too that I'm kind of jazzed about Chickasaw plums because they are variable. I've found apparently the arboretum at the J.C. Ralston Arboretum in, where was that, Raleigh, NC State.
Mm-hmm.
They have some kind of purple beauty cultivar thing. But what I've found, in fact, is that roughly 25% of the seeds that have been coming up under some that I have in my yard are purple. So I think it's a recessive gene that sometimes gets expressed in these things.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. And before that, the only thing I was going to add was that, again, the tercentennial of Catesby's arrival is going to be sometime next year. And the Catesby Center has a lot of things kind of planned to recognize that. And I think there are a lot of other events potentially being planned through, I think it's the Lexington County Museum, and South Carolina Wildlife Magazine might be doing sort of a commemorative issue as well. So a lot of things to look forward to as far as Catesbyana goes in the near future.
A couple of others related to Catesby. You mentioned that Catesby wasn't a professional artist. Would he have been considered a professional botanist, or?
I think he was good. He was good at what he did. I don't know in terms of like specimen wise what else he sent, but I do know that he sent a number of seeds and just plant parts and that sort of thing to be grown in gardens, and that he has a fairly extensive See you later. Fairly extensive collection of herbarium specimens at Oxford, and they're in pretty decent shape now. I mean, they're recognizable, and in that sense, I think he knew what he was doing, which is it's kind of weird because nowadays we use all these high-tech gadgets like ovens and that sort of thing to dry our specimens, but back then they didn't have such luxuries. So how they were able to prevent specimens that were mounted or squashed between not the greatest quality paper that may have been somewhat acidic, and keep them dry and free from mold and that sort of thing. It means, at least in the sense of being a botanical collector, he was accomplished. And how he could identify those things is questionable, because we're pre-Linnaean at that point in time. You know, it's well before 1753 when he was drumming up these names, and he has all these polynomials and whatnot. So you can definitely say he wasn't good at Linnaean taxonomy, but he at least could recognize the differences between the plants that he was seeing.
All right. Another question was, do we know where Catesby saw the trillium that bears his name?
I don't. I could try to pin that down. There's, I mean, being that trilliums tend to be, well, that one's sort of widespread, I guess, but being that we have a sense of where his inland limits were, we might be able to kind of narrow it down to some
right
less broad of an area.
Okay, fair enough. So there was, you didn't see any mention of it that you recall in his writings.
No, but I'll qualify that with I haven't like really
Sure.
scrutinized his treatment of it. So.
Understood.
Yeah.
Okay. Any other questions? Y'all can unmute yourselves, I think. And
Loblolly is, I can actually answer this one. Loblolly was a term applied to a deckhand on ships, and they were usually younger boys that were considered to be of diminished intellect and silly. And so loblolly, in that sense, with reference to Loblolly Bay, is in reference to the wood being sort of soft and springy, and it's not very sturdy. It reminds me sort of this in rice seedlings. There's something that the Chinese translation was foolish seedling disease, and the rice seedlings apparently would get infected with some sort of fungus, and this would cause them to become etiolated, and it messed with their hormones and caused was it gibberellins or something that caused cell elongation, so the seedlings would be very lanky and just sort of fall over. And so that's kind of the same concept that you get with loblolly things just being not very sturdy wood, essentially.
all right. Any other questions? I don't see anything else in the chat. Well, Herrick, thank you so much. This has been, I have found this very, very interesting. It sounds like from the questions we got, other folks did as well. We'll have to plant a tree in your honor on the Roseway Trail
Okay.
as a thank you.